For most of recorded history, the fate of the world has been decided by empires that believed power alone could shape the future. Kings, dictators, and authoritarian regimes rose and fell, leaving behind ruins, broken nations, and generations shaped by fear and uncertainty. Yet the 20th century would present a challenge unlike any before it, a conflict so vast, so destructive, and so morally defining that it would force humanity to confront a single unavoidable question. Would the future belong to freedom, or would it be ruled by tyranny? World War II did not erupt overnight. It was a result of years of unresolved tensions, economic collapse, and the dangerous belief that strength without accountability could dominate entire continents. Across Europe and Asia, authoritarian powers expanded rapidly, exploiting nationalism, resentment, and fear. Democracies appeared slow and divided, while centralized regimes moved with ruthless efficiency. Many believed that free societies simply could not respond fast enough to survive in a world increasingly shaped by total control. At the center of this growing storm stood the United States, a nation separated from the chaos by two vast oceans, still recovering from the Great Depression, and deeply scarred by the memory of World War I. Americans remember the cost of that earlier conflict. Families remembered sons who never returned. Communities remembered promises made that such sacrifice would never be demanded again. Isolationism was not apathy. It was exhaustion. The nation wanted peace, stability, and time to heal. But history does not wait for comfort. As the 1930s progressed, warning signs became impossible to ignore. Nazi Germany transformed itself into a militarized state built on obedience, propaganda, and fear. Industrial power was converted into a weapon of domination. Borders collapsed. Entire nations fell in weeks. At the same time, Imperial Japan pursued its own vision of expansion across Asia and the Pacific, convinced that force was the only path to survival and dominance. What made this moment uniquely dangerous was not just military aggression, but ideology. These regimes believed democracy was weak. They believed freedom created disorder. They believed the future belonged to absolute authority and centralized control. To them, the American model, individual liberty, open markets, and democratic debate, was not merely different. It was a threat. For years, the United States watched cautiously. American leaders understood the danger, but they also understood the reality at home. The public was not ready for war. Still, preparations quietly began. Industrial capacity was analyzed. Military doctrine was reevaluated. Strategic planning took place behind closed doors. The United States was not asleep. It was observing, learning, and preparing, aware that a moment might come when hesitation would no longer be an option. That moment arrived on the morning of December 7th, 1941. In a single attack, the illusion of safety vanished. Pearl Harbor was not just a military strike. It was a direct challenge to American sovereignty. Ships burned in the harbor. Lives were lost without warning. Shock rippled across the nation. Distance, once believed to be protection, proved meaningless. Yet what followed was not panic, but unity. Political divisions faded almost overnight. Factories prepared to shift production. Young men lined up to enlist. Families reorganized their lives around the reality of war. The attack ignited something powerful within the American spirit, a shared understanding that freedom, once threatened, must be defended without hesitation. America did not enter World War II gradually. It entered completely. The true strength of the United States was never limited to its military alone. It resided in its people, ordinary citizens who understood that history had placed an extraordinary responsibility on their generation. They did not fight because they were ordered to. They fought because they believed something fundamental was at stake: the survival of freedom, the future of democracy, and the right of nations to choose their own destiny. This generation would later be called the greatest generation, not because they sought recognition, but because their actions redefined what collective sacrifice could achieve. They worked longer hours, accepted rationing, endured separation, and faced uncertainty with quiet determination. They did not yet know how the war would end, but they understood one thing with absolute clarity: failure was not an option, and this was only the beginning. When the United States entered World War II, it faced a reality few nations had ever confronted. It was not enough to fight. America had outproduced, outbuilt, and outlast its enemies on a scale never before imagined. Victory would not be decided only on battlefields, but in factories, shipyards, railroads, and assembly lines stretching from coast to coast. Before the war, the American economy was still recovering from the Great Depression. Millions were unemployed. Factories stood idle. Industrial capacity existed, but it was underutilized. What followed after Pearl Harbor was one of the fastest and most complete economic transformations in human history. Civilian production halted almost overnight. Automobile factories stopped building cars and began producing tanks, aircraft engines, and armored vehicles. Typewriter companies manufactured machine guns. Refrigerator plants produced aircraft parts. This was not chaos. It was coordination. Government, private industry, and labor unions aligned around a single objective: total mobilization. The United States did not nationalize industry, but it directed it with unprecedented precision. Production quotas were established. Raw materials were allocated strategically. Efficiency became a national priority. Every delay was treated as a risk to lives overseas. By 1943, the scale of American production stunned the world. Ships were launched faster than enemy submarines could sink them. Aircraft rolled off assembly lines in numbers that reshaped the balance of power. The United States was not merely supplying its own forces. It was supplying its allies. Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and countless resistance movements depended on American production to survive. America had become what President Franklin D. Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. This transformation would not have been possible without a fundamental shift in American society. With millions of men deployed overseas, the home front required a new workforce. Women stepped into roles once considered unreachable. They operated heavy machinery, welded steel, assembled aircraft, and managed logistics. They did not replace men. They redefined capability. The image of Rosie the Riveter became a symbol, but the reality was far broader. Women worked long hours under intense pressure, often while raising families and managing households alone. Their contribution was not temporary. It permanently altered the American workforce and reshaped social expectations for generations to come. At the same time, sacrifice became a shared experience. Rationing affected every household. Gasoline, meat, sugar, rubber, and even clothing were strictly controlled. Families planted victory gardens. Children collected scrap metal. Nothing was wasted. Every citizen understood that comfort had been exchanged for purpose. The war effort erased many divisions. Political disagreements seemed smaller. Regional identities blurred. Americans no longer asked what the government could do for them. They asked what they could do for victory. This unity was not enforced by fear, but sustained by belief. A belief that their effort mattered. A belief that freedom required participation. By the midpoint of the war, the impact of American industrial power became impossible to ignore. Axis planners had assumed the United States would take years to mobilize. Instead, it overwhelmed them with scale. The United States produced more aircraft than Germany and Japan combined, more ships than the rest of the world together. Logistics became a weapon, fuel, food, ammunition, and vehicles arrived where and when they were needed. But production alone did not guarantee victory. What made the difference was coordination. American strategy focused on sustainability. While enemies exhausted their economies and manpower, the United States expanded both. Soldiers at the front trusted that supplies would arrive. Allies trusted that support would continue. This reliability became a psychological advantage, as powerful as any weapon. The war was becoming global, and America was now its central engine. Yet even with factories roaring and supply lines stretching across oceans, the hardest battles still lay ahead. Industrial strength would soon be tested against entrenched enemies, unforgiving terrain, and the brutal realities of modern warfare. The question was no longer whether America could build the tools of victory, but whether its soldiers could endure the cost of using them. And soon, they would be asked to do exactly that. By the time American industry reached full strength, the war had already scarred much of the world. Europe was bleeding. Asia was burning. Entire nations had fallen under occupation, and millions lived under fear, hunger, and repression. When American forces began arriving in large numbers, they did not enter a quiet conflict. They entered a global catastrophe already years in the making. For many American soldiers, this was their first time leaving home. They crossed oceans not knowing what awaited them, armed not only with rifles and training, but with the weight of expectation. The United States was no longer a distant supplier. It was now a direct participant, and the world was watching. In North Africa, American troops faced the brutal realities of modern mechanized warfare. The early battles were not flawless. Mistakes were made. Lessons were learned under fire. But unlike its enemies, the United States adapted quickly. Command structures improved. Coordination between ground forces, air power, and logistics strengthened. What began as inexperience transformed into effectiveness. Each battle hardened American forces. Each loss sharpened strategy. The United States was not fighting to conquer territory. It was fighting to dismantle a system of domination that threatened the entire world. June 6, 1944, a date that would define a generation. D-Day was not simply a military operation. It was a calculated gamble on an unprecedented scale. Thousands of ships crossed the English Channel under darkness. Paratroopers descended behind enemy lines. Soldiers packed into landing crafts knew the odds were unforgiving. Many understood they might not return. When the ramps dropped on the beaches of Normandy, American forces faced relentless fire. The terrain offered little protection. The enemy was entrenched. Chaos unfolded in minutes. Yet amid confusion and fear, soldiers moved forward, not because victory was guaranteed, but because retreat was not an option. What happened on those beaches was not the result of luck. It was discipline, coordination, and resolve. Air superiority limited enemy movement. Naval artillery provided support. Logistics ensured reinforcements kept coming. Piece by piece, footholds were secured. The success of D-Day marked a turning point. For the first time, Nazi Germany faced a sustained, large-scale invasion from the West. The balance of the war shifted. Momentum changed hands. But this victory came at a terrible cost. Thousands of Americans never left the beaches they stormed. Their sacrifice was immediate, final, and irreversible. They did not live to see the liberation of Europe. But Europe was liberated because of them. While Europe moved toward liberation, another war raged across the vast Pacific. Here, distance itself was an enemy. Islands separated by thousands of miles became battlegrounds. Each advance required meticulous planning, overwhelming logistics, and relentless determination. The Pacific War was unforgiving. Dense jungles, extreme heat, and fortified enemy positions turned every island into a test of endurance. Battles were fought not just against opposing forces, but against terrain, disease, and exhaustion. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. American strategy adapted once again. Instead of capturing every island, the United States targeted key positions, cutting off enemy supply lines and rendering strongholds irrelevant. This approach, known as island hopping, reduced casualties while maintaining relentless pressure. Naval power proved decisive. Aircraft carriers extended American reach across oceans. Submarines disrupted enemy logistics. Air superiority isolated battlefields before ground forces arrived. The Pacific became a demonstration of combined arms warfare at its most complex. Yet victory was never abstract for those fighting. It was personal. Every island carried names etched into history: Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each represented sacrifice, perseverance, and unyielding resolve. By the final years of the war, it was clear the United States had not only entered the conflict, it had reshaped it. The tide had turned in both hemispheres. The Axis powers were retreating. The outcome was no longer uncertain. But the war's end would demand one final, unprecedented decision, a decision that would redefine warfare, global power, and America's role in the world forever. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Europe, the collapse of Nazi Germany became inevitable. American troops advanced through devastated cities and shattered infrastructure, witnessing firsthand the consequences of totalitarian ambition unchecked. What they found went beyond military targets. They uncovered evidence of systematic brutality, mass imprisonment, and crimes that shocked even seasoned soldiers. The liberation of concentration camps revealed the true scale of what the war had been fought to stop. These moments transformed the conflict from a geopolitical struggle into a moral reckoning. The sacrifices made on distant shores were no longer abstract. They were justified by the lives saved and the future restored. When Germany formally surrendered in May of 1945, celebrations erupted across the United States. Church bells rang. Factories paused. Families gathered in streets and town squares. But beneath the joy was reflection. Nearly every American family had been touched by loss. Victory had been earned, not given. Europe lay in ruins, but it was free. And the role of the United States in that outcome was undeniable. Without American manpower, industry, leadership, and resolve, liberation would not have come when it did, or perhaps at all. While peace returned to Europe, the war in the Pacific remained fiercely contested. American leaders faced a grim reality. Every island gain came at enormous cost. Projections for a mainland invasion of Japan warned of casualties on a scale unseen in human history. The decision that followed was among the most difficult ever made by any nation. The use of atomic weapons was not driven by conquest, but by calculation, a belief that ending the war decisively could ultimately save millions of lives on both sides. When Japan surrendered in August of 1945, World War II came to an end. The conflict that consumed the globe was finally over. The world stood at a crossroads, entering an era defined by unprecedented power and responsibility. The United States emerged not just as a victor, but as the central architect of the post-war order. With unmatched economic strength, global reach, and moral authority earned through sacrifice, America faced a new challenge: how to secure peace after winning war. What followed was one of the greatest acts of reconstruction in human history. Rather than retreat into isolation or exploit victory, the United States invested in rebuilding former battlegrounds. Europe was stabilized. Economies were revived. Democratic institutions were strengthened. At home, American soldiers returned not as conquerors, but as citizens. They became builders, teachers, engineers, and leaders. The greatest generation did not seek glory. It created stability. Their values shaped decades of prosperity and global cooperation. The legacy of World War II redefined what it meant to be American. Strength was paired with responsibility. Power was guided by principle. Leadership was exercised not for dominance, but for order. Today's world, its institutions, alliances, and freedoms, still rests on foundations laid during that era. The story of how America won World War II is not merely a military history. It is the story of a nation that answered history's call when the stakes were absolute. For Americans, this is a reminder of who they are and what they are capable of when united by purpose. The greatest generation did not just win a war, they shaped a century. And in doing so, they ensured that when freedom was most threatened, it was the United States that stood firm and prevailed.